Hello, today we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to try to teach you how to replace an electrical outlet. Now if you see one like this with a crack in the plate or a crack down here, which is more important by the ground, it's time to replace it, and it's very easy to do. You're going to need a line tester, some electricity safe screwdrivers. I like these with the little stick on there, which will come in handy, and I'll show you why later. Phillips is standard. A new faceplate, of course. A replacement outlet. And these things that I like to keep around, which are some spacers. You may not need them, but if you're working on an old house like we do, I like to keep them handy. Also, these sealers work awesome if you have the stucco that's coming off. I don't use them in this project, but they're always good to keep handy, and they're cheap. Also, of course, some wire strippers and some leather gloves. So let's get started. Now before I even got started, I made sure to hit the breaker, so there's no power coming to this outlet. Now when you're dealing with an old home, you always have to be prepared for surprises, as you'll see here. I have two different screws here. I have a Phillips and a standard, and I find out right now why that's the case. Apparently, you see how that just popped out? That's not supposed to happen. The previous owners had put a thicker screw in there because they had washed out the thread inside the junction box. Now I had already hit the breaker, but it's always best to double check in case you have power coming from multiple lines. Now you see me being extra safe here, testing it both ways in case there was something wrong with the outlet itself. I'm touching the cables and there's no power, so let's go ahead and start taking it apart. And be careful not to unscrew these side screws completely. They're not supposed to come off. They're just supposed to give you enough freedom where you can pop out these cables. So do not take the screw off completely. If you're new to this sort of work, pay attention to the way the screws are coming out. They're coming out counterclockwise. So when you put them back in, you're going to want to wrap them around in such a way that they're going with the screw, so not against it when you're tightening. As you're doing this, you may notice that there's one bare wire attached to a green screw that seems to be just floating there. That's the ground. Don't forget to screw that one back in. You want to pay attention to this little notch here. If it's broken, you will need to do the same, and here's justification why. If you have separate feed coming into each of them, you'll want to separate them by only disconnecting the one on the black side. And there's some additional information if that fits your situation. Now I had plenty of cable, and you'll see that there's some scorching on it. It's been a while since these were replaced, so I just go ahead and I clip them. You may not want to do this if your wires are already too short. This is where the wire stripper comes in really handy. What I'm doing here is just straightening them out so that they're easy to manage. Please make sure to not strip them way too thin. I always start with the largest, and if that fits, that's the one I go with. It can get a little tricky to strip that cabling, especially if they're old, but if you straightened out the wire like I did, you should be okay. And here's where that little stick on the side comes in handy. Instead of using needle nose pliers, I like to use that little stick that's in there, and it works great for making a very nice curve. I'm just stripping all these other cables, and you saw how easy that was to connect once it was curved well. Double, triple, and quadruple check to make sure that you plug these cables back into their correct sides. The last thing you want to do is start a fire. When you see me here curving the last black cable, if you have a very nice curve to it, it should slide right in. And if you notice, I'm wrapping it around clockwise, so when I screw it in, it's going to go with the screw, not against it. Now we're just doing the white, and this shouldn't take very long. At this point, you're more than halfway done. It's just a question of repeating the process for the 4 other screws. Don't screw it in too tight because you can break the outlet. So just make sure it's nice and snug. Here was another little surprise for me. I noticed the junction box was moving, so it wasn't screwed in well. You have to be sure to work extra carefully with these older houses, or you can cause more damage than good. And here's one of the final steps, putting in that ground. Cutting off that extra slack on each cable made fitting the new outlet into the old junction box a little bit easier. Here I'm using the 2 new screws that came with the outlet, but if you remember, that top screw was the wrong size, so it didn't take. I had to pull out the big gun. If you're into the same situation, make sure that your setting is not on drill. You want it to give if you screwed it in too far. So that worked great. We'll put it on the faceplate now, doing the final touches. Make sure that you do not screw in this one too hard either, because you will crack that faceplate. So all that's left is to hit the breaker and test it. Works good. Now we're going to plug in the cable. It's brand new, so it may be a little snug, and that's normal. So all that's left is to make it child safe, and we're done. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe. Hope I saved you some money.